Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Star Wars Alliance, your home on Geek Ultimate Alliance Podcast Network for any and all things Star Wars. I'm your host, as always, Katie, and with me, like always, it's a typical day of the week. It's Clay. Clay, how are you doing today?
I am doing fairly well. Had a little bit of a late night. Um, of course, we have a very special episode today. But talking about the book from a certain point of view, Return of the Jedi. But I did, in fact, edit the podcast that we recorded this weekend, which is the actual review of this book. Uh,
Woo-hoo.
this is actually dropping for any of those who are listening to this the next day. Of course, we record on Wednesdays. If you're listening to this on Thursday, you should already have the review already in your feed as well, so you can listen to this interview, yes, interview, and then you can go listen to the actual review of the book. Remember, this is a hefty book. We have a lot to talk about in that review, but we decided to go with Katie. We kind of cheated, but it was top 5 favorite stories, and then honorable mentions, and then we threw some more out there. There was just so much that we enjoyed that we couldn't let just slip by. But of course, it's not just me that is with us in this
Yes.
recording today. In this episode, of course, we are here with Tom, of course, the editor of any and all Star Wars books, basically. Del Rey books, am I right, Tom?
That's right.
All right. And of course, he is I can never pronounce this right when I look at your Twitter account. Pronounce it for me.
Darth Internus.
Internus. Okay. Okay. Darth Internus over at Twitter. And I know you recently had a Blue Sky account, so go check that out as well. But you have also been doing some amazing work over on your Substack. So if you
Yes.
guys can please subscribe to that as well. Very, very informative and a hefty task that you have been putting out since your campaign to do all of that. I know you were kind of lofting the idea of making a Substack, but I think that's very, very cool that you've been doing that.
Thank you. I'm glad you're enjoying.
Yeah, it's definitely one that went immediately on my list to read. Because I always like hearing like the behind the scenes stuff. So,
All right.
but yes, Clay is going to get us started with our first question. We are going to be basically talking about the From a Certain Point of View, Return of the Jedi books, but not just the recent book that came out, Return of the Jedi. We're going to just kind of be talking about the full process, because this is a trilogy that's completed, and it's been 6 years, top to bottom,
5.
5 years. Okay,
Oh wait, is it 6? No, yeah, you're right. It's 6. Sorry, 2017.
okay, yeah.
Uh, I could do math.
Anyway,
So,
I wanted to make sure. So, but yeah, it's an impressive feat considering, I've got the stack right here. It's a tall stack, and they just got a little bit bigger each time.
They did. They did. They got bigger and longer each time.
so of course, the first question that we have for you today is, uh, what are your favorite memories from completing this trilogy overall of from a certain point of view?
Oh, uh, so I have one general and then two specific ones. The general one is just getting to work with so many different creators on helping them craft and write and find their Star Wars story. I mean, across all three anthologies, there are 108 unique contributors because, of course, we had some folks who've written across multiple anthologies. But of the 120 stories, we have 108 unique contributors. And of that 108 number, so many of them are people who were making their first contribution to Star Wars in this series. And so getting to sit down, it's my favorite thing about being a book editor overall is working with folks on developing books and stories. So to get to do that so many times over with so many different people who have who all have the same passion for Star Wars, but all come to it from a different place, all come to it with a different connection and a different experience. and getting to guide and help each one of them develop their story is just like the kind of larger enduring memory. The two specific memories that I have is for the first book, around New York Comic Con, we did a New York Comic Con panel, and we were able to have, I think, like 14 of the authors or something like that who were at that panel. And it was a 90-minute panel, and we actually like rotated people on and off the stage. We like had a bunch of people on the stage, and they'd chat for a while and then rotate them off and get the next group. And we did that a couple of times. And we also paired that with like a special edition of the book that all those authors had signed. And while that panel was really great, it's wonderful. It's on YouTube. It was moderated by Pablo Hidalgo, who was just like masterful wrangling that many people into a coherent and entertaining panel. But the best part about that is, in order to get all those books signed, we had to have all the authors come to this room in a building near where New York Comic Con was being held earlier in the day and sign all the books. And it ended up being this really small room, and it was like a really hot, humid day in New York. And like, it was this almost awful experience. I mean, it was actually totally fine, but like the authors were like, "What are you doing?" Like throwing us into this like sweaty, like hot room. And everyone's having a really good time, but like, it just stands out, just kind of a little bit of hilarity that was built around that particular event. But it was really cool, and it was a fun celebration. The second other memory that I have is, oddly enough, another convention memory, which is 2019 Star Wars Celebration Chicago. We have our booth there, and we had decided, now remember, it's 2019, so only the first book exists, because FactPov ESB was 2020. We had decided, like, oh, we know that a couple of the authors from the first book are going to be in Celebration at Chicago. It's a Star Wars convention. Why don't we have like a little 3-author signing at our booth? And we'll have a couple of people. And so we planned to do that. And then as the show got closer, we heard, oh, well, this other person's coming. Okay, well, we'll add them. And then this other person's coming. All right, we'll add them. And it kept going and it kept going. And by the time we got to the show, we had 8 people to sign this booth. But when we get to the show, we heard that 2 more people were coming. And we just we didn't want to say no to anybody. We didn't want to turn in the authors away. We thought it would just be weird. It's like, yeah, but what if like everybody but that one author who's here gets to print? This is weird. So what we ended up doing is we had 10 authors, and we destroyed our booth in order to make it work. We actually had to basically take every book off of every table and every inch of space and cram all the authors together. And then we went to line people up. And anyone who's been to any convention, but particularly Star Wars Celebration, or if you've come specifically to Star Wars, the Del Rey Star Wars, the Star Wars books booth, we line folks up for book signings, and you wait in line, you walk up, get a book sign. And we started to line people up, and it was an hour before the signing was going to start. We already had 200 people in line, and we only have an hour-long signing. And to give you a little bit of behind the scenes knowledge, generally speaking, you feel like if you're doing an hour-long signing with just one author, you usually budget that you could do like between 80 and 100 people, depending on how fast an author is. Some authors are much slower in terms of signings, some are much longer. So you try to budget in that like 70 to 90 range, but that's just kind of a number you have in your head. So we already have 200 people in line, and it's an hour for the show. So we capped the line because we're like, okay. But all these people just were like, we know you capped the line, but we want to wait in line anyway because we'd love to participate, because this is kind of a one-time opportunity. So what we did was we were like, okay, cool. Anybody who wants to can stand in this extra line. 2 things. 1, you have to know that we can't guarantee that you're going to get a book signed. You may stand here for an hour, and then I might just tell you sorry. Actually, you may stay here for over an hour. Then the second thing we told them is, look, we have this arranged. We're not blocking anything, but if the security folks for the show come over and say, hey guys, this line's too long, it's getting out of hand, you would have to leave. Is that okay? And everyone in line in that overflow area, everyone understood that. And this funny thing started happening, that as more people got into the overflow line, everybody in the line would give them the spiel. And everybody was just holding hands. And we ended up actually having 450 books signed in an hour.
Wow.
And we were able to accommodate every single person who had stood in line and every single overflow person. And the way that we did this, I apologize, it's a very long story, but
no, it's all good. It's all good.
The way that we were able to do this is a couple of the staff members, a couple of us were standing around and we're like, well, we got to keep this line efficient. And one thing that you can do with a book line to be efficient is have everyone have their book ready to whatever page that a book's going to be signed on. So, put a bookmark, if you got the flap, put the flap in at the title page so that when you open the book, nobody's got to like fish through looking for it, right?
Mhm.
Even if you save 5 seconds a person, when you start talking about 200, 400 people, 5 seconds a person, adds up. So we're like, okay, we'll have everybody flap their book to the title page, put the book on the table, and we'll just slide it down the table, and every author will just sign, and we'll tell every author, hey, try to sign in the same spot. So you don't have to move the books or anything, just and we'll be able to go. Then we had this other thought. We're like, well, these books, each chapter header, each author gets their little chapter header. And we're like, well, some people might want the authors to sign on the chapter headers. What if they want to do that? And we're like, well, so we decided to accommodate everybody. And we made this decision. We said, okay, we're going to give every person in the line a choice, either the title page or the first page of each story. If you choose title page, we just went through and said, hey, if you want title page, just flap your book to the title page so it opens on the table. You open, you go. For everybody else, what we did was we actually created piles of sticky note little slips, 10 sets of them, and handed them out to every single person who wanted them. And me and a couple other staff people memorized the 10 first pages. So it was like, so we would stand in front of a group of people in the line. Like I'd go to a group of 10 people. I'd say, all right, everybody who's doing first page of the chapter, pay attention, please. Everyone would look at me. I'd say, okay, take these stickies. I'd say, okay, what you're going to do is you're going to put a little sticky on each one so that when we have all these tabs, right? So then each author can just turn to the next tab, right? It's foolproof.
Yeah.
So I said, okay, you ready? Here we go. Page 10, page 17, page 27, page 34, page 63. And we would just go all the way down the list. And then I'd go to the next group of people and we do it again.
Insane.
And because we had people wait, this was one of the benefits, because we had people waiting in line so long, because people showed up so early, we had all this time to like do all this stuff so that when the signing started, it was just clockwork and everything just moved. And then I went to the authors and I was like, authors, pay attention to me. Here's how this works. I need you all to do, because the authors were chatting, having a good time. I was like, I need you all to pay attention. If you see no tabs, just sign on the title page and keep it moving. If you see tabs, just take the next tab and go. And it worked beautifully. And it was such a wonderful communal moment. It was a logistical triumph, but there was so much joy in that line. There was so much joy in that signing. And it ultimately, one of the things about these books is just like how much joy is inherent in not just their creation, but the reaction to them, the way that people celebrate them. And that experience, as hectic and really ultimately ridiculous as it was when I think back on it, was so emblematic of that joy that I always think of when I think about these books.
The Star Wars book community is so awesome. Like I can never get past how like some of my interactions have gone on Twitter. And you were talking about 2017 New York Comic Con, and I just remember seeing those pictures. I think you were posting them and some of the authors were posting them on my Twitter feed, and just kind of talking about how insane that day was. That's totally awesome. I love it. The next question, kind of talking about the trilogy overall, is did anything change between the books, and if so, how? And I had a couple examples here, like bringing in the new creators, because obviously 108 individual creators, choosing particular characters for the books, and obviously I think this is probably my favorite example, seeing some of the character pitches get wilder.
Yeah. So as far as like the process of making these, that hasn't really changed from book to book. The overall process that we went through, the kind of way we managed the project, hasn't really changed. We've definitely gotten better at it as each book has gotten a little more efficient, done a few different things in terms of just like the organization, the way we set up our spreadsheets or files or whatever, like very mechanical stuff. But almost everything else about how the books were made has been exactly the same from book 1 to book 3. So, in terms of creators, we always wanted each time to bring in a real as exciting a group of creators as we could. And while we loved having folks come back to do multiple stories, we really always looked at the series as a way to, one, be able to celebrate with creators beyond just authors, so folks who are journalists or working in other parts of entertainment or pop culture. So expanding the voices outside of just book or comic authors. But also to always be intentional about trying to bring more new voices into Star Wars, because that's one of the things that we celebrate about Star Wars overall. That's one of the legacies of Star Wars, is the fact that it brings new voices into it and they contribute to it, and those new voices become part of the overall tapestry, but they also affect and change and drive Star Wars forward because they're new, because they're different, because they bring an element that Star Wars hasn't had before. So we did try to bring as many new authors as we could each time through. Um, as far as like how characters got chosen, again, that remained exactly the same, which was that it was really author driven. As long as it was a character who could fit within the bounds of one of the films and had a connection to a scene or some element of the film, a character was pretty much fair game. And the other rules about choosing characters never really wavered. Nobody, we can't have two of the same character in the book. There's not going to be, two Wedge Antilles stories. And, people can't tell a story from the POV of Han, Luke, Leia, or Darth Vader, or really the droids, because like those characters are already the main characters. Those kinds of things were consistent throughout. And I think that helped not only us stay consistent in making these books, but it gave all the contributors a sense of consistency about what the possibility space was. And I think that gets to the last thing, which is, you are totally right. The character pitches and the storytelling styles and the kind of audacity of the storytelling choices that the authors were making, I think got grander as the books went on. And I don't want anyone to misinterpret and think that means that I somehow think the first set of stories are lesser. No, in fact, it's because of that first set of stories that I think that happened. Because I think with each anthology, the creators who were coming to whatever entry they were writing for looked at the previous one or looked at the previous two and saw, oh my gosh, I could do that. Oh my God. Okay. I'm going to try, I can be that bold. I can be that audacious in my storytelling forms. What characters wait a minute, you can write a story about the cave? Okay. And I think it gave permission and gave a model for each group of creators who was coming after to just go bigger and to go wider and to try something more and more. I think that's actually a gift that each book gives to its next its subsequent book. You're totally right. And that was super exciting. And that was actually probably something that did change on our end, which was that because we had that experience, because we saw the possibility space of the kinds of stories that people were telling, with each new entry, we could be even bolder in talking to the authors as we were developing those stories and saying, hey, you can push this even more. Hey, we can actually dial this up from where it already is, because we already knew it would work.
Yeah. I know a lot of people, and I'm just saying this, but a lot of people, when they saw a Dexter Jettster story in Return of the Jedi, were like, where the heck is he in the movie? That makes no sense. But reading the story, it makes total sense, and putting it in that place, it's such an awesome connection. And while it's wild, it totally works, and I'm super glad it does.
Yeah, I think it's great. I think stories like that or choices like that bring that sense of surprise to the anthology, that, you're like, oh, this is an anthology about a movie I've seen, 5, 10, a dozen, a movie I know so well. What could be new or surprising about it? And that is one of those things that a lot of the authors are really great about, discovering those spaces and those moments where the story could still really be surprising, even if, these films like the back of your hand.
Yeah.
One of the things that I have been saying, particularly about Return of the Jedi from a certain point of view, and I've said it in our book club that we have at the end of every single episode, and especially in our review that we did this weekend, is that it blows my mind how you take a character that literally, while you're watching the movie, you blink and you miss that character, and they have this overarching beautiful background and this huge story behind them, but it's just this minuscule character, and they've made it so big in this one book. It's one of my favorite things about this one in particular, because I've fallen in love with a lot of the stories in this book.
That's awesome. That's amazing.
Third question is, when creating from a certain point of view, how did the timeline of each movie affect the creation of the actual book series?
This is a really great question. And there's really two reasons. And what's kind of interesting is that if you look at the three films, I put Empire and Jedi, I pair them together over here, and then I have A New Hope sitting by itself for this reason, is that the very first thing we would do when creating any of these is the team would sit down and we'd watch the movie and we'd say that we were working, which is a funny thing to say. We watched the movie and we would do kind of an initial survey of the film. We would write down, oh, yeah, you could have a story about this character. You could have in this scene. Oh, these 5 people appear. And we'd break down kind of the scenes a little bit and just lay the film out just to give us a scope of like, what does this look like? And one of the things that we found is that like, if you look at A New Hope, it's a really kind of balanced movie. There are set pieces or scenes with lots of characters all throughout the film. Like you rarely go more than a few minutes without having a bunch of characters, whether you go from the blockade runner and then there's a little bit with not that much, but then you've got a big Imperial meeting and then there's the cantina and then not that much and then the Death Star escape and then not that much and then, rebel briefings and then the big attack. Like there's this interesting kind of balance. And even in the moments when the movie gets, isn't quite the right word, but like when it gets quieter, when there's only a few characters, there's usually still a couple of characters that you could so easily be like, oh, you could tell a story about that character, whatever. The other 2 movies are not balanced in that same way. They are both very heavy at the very beginning and sort of the very end. ESB is like the Hoth scene has a bunch of characters. And then in the middle of the movie, there's not that many characters. There's tons of scenes where it's like, it's just Luke and Yoda, or it's just Han and Leia. There's no one else. Or you have like scenes that are all cutting into each other constantly. So you don't get these longer scenes. You've got like, these people are running from the asteroid and Luke's training and these Imperials are talking and these people are doing, it's just, everything is overlapping. Return of the Jedi is interestingly the same way because it opens obviously with, Jabba's palace scene, the Battle of Endor at the end. And in the between, we've got all this intercutting and all these kind of shorter things. So it's funny that you have this balanced one and these 2, they're not unbalanced, but they're just balanced in a different way or they're structured a different way. And that affected things because we always wanted each book to celebrate the whole movie. So when you have something like A New Hope, it was actually relatively easy to make sure that we were representing basically every scene in the film in some way. And we didn't have like 40 stories in the cantina. There are a bunch of stories in the cantina because there's a lot of characters there, right? But that one was pretty easy to lay out and pretty easy to see those opportunities. For the other 2 books, there was we had to be a little more concerted in being like, we cannot have 30 scenes set on Hoth. Hoth is very important to The Empire Strikes Back, but like we cannot have 30 stories set there. So on the latter 2 books, we actually had to do this thing where after a certain amount of time, we'd almost close off a part of the film. So once we got to a certain number of Hoth stories or Endor stories, as more authors came on, because, the authors would come on board at, different moments as we were recruiting folks and talking to folks. And we would sort of say, we kind of have a lot of stories set in Jabba's palace. So if you'd be cool at maybe looking at a character or a scene somewhere else in the movie, that would be great. And we left ourselves all the grace of like, if someone came up with an amazing idea for a story in one of those denser sections, we totally would let them do it. But we tried to, be like, okay, we've got enough of these stories now. And we had to be a little more, organized like that for the latter 2 books, just because. The other thing, though, that it really affected was the final order of the stories within the books. Because again, A New Hope's a pretty balanced thing, and it's like each scene just flows into the next. There's definitely a sense that a few scenes here and there are overlapping or happening at the same time, but there's not a lot of cross-cutting. It's like a lot of scenes end, and then we wipe and go to the next scene. And then the next scene ends, and we go to the next scene. Or we jump forward in time. There's not a lot of intercutting. And so ordering those stories was actually pretty easy. I think we came up with the initial order, and then I think we moved to like 5 stories around, and it was mostly just like, flip-flop these 2, that kind of those little small tweaks. For the other 2 films, we had to order and reorder those stories a bunch of times. I actually was looking at this the other day because someone else was asking me about it. For The Empire Strikes Back, we reordered all of the stories 5 times. And for Return of the Jedi, we did it 3 times. One, because I think we got a little bit better at ordering the stories, so Return of the Jedi, we leveraged some experience. But we had to reorder them because you would just look at a bunch of those scenes and you're just like, these 2 scenes are happening on top of each other, and this one starts, and then we go away from it, and we go this one, we come back to it, and there's a lot of that. And so that created some more challenge in ordering the stories. It made things a little more different. We couldn't just rely on, oh, well, where does the story start? Because that often wouldn't be enough to figure out where should it go in the tapestry. So we had to come up with a whole bunch of new rules about how we order the stories for that really came into play in the second and the third book. So those are the two things. Obviously, none of the movies have a problem with like, oh man, are we going to be able to get 40 characters out of this? That was never a question. Never once. No one was ever worried about that because Star Wars movies have, umpteen numbers of characters that you could feasibly write stories about. It really was just a matter of like, oh no, are we going to get 30 Ewok stories? And we didn't.
I will say they are
Um,
some of my favorite, by the way. Just
Listen,
letting people know.
FactPov, oops, all Ewoks is out there.
Very, very
Yes.
good. Katie, you have the next one.
Yes. So, Boba Fett is one of a few characters that have a story in all three from a certain point of view books. Were there any special considerations made to connect or disconnect the three stories together for any character?
This is another really great question because I love getting to talk about the ways in which the stories in these anthologies connect and interconnect. So specifically for Boba Fett, not really, because there wasn't a whole lot specifically done, because his stories really take place at like these three very distinct moments in his life. And so, the story that Paul Dini wrote for the first one, when you're going to write the story about him in Jabba's palace in Return of the Jedi, there's not really a whole lot you need to leverage from that first story, because again, it's not necessarily a follow-on, even though it's the same character. In all the cases where we would have an author taking on a character who already had a FactPov story from a previous entry, in like 99.999% of those cases, the author already knew that. And they were like, yeah, I was actually already, part of the reason I chose this character is like, I was influenced by this story. Like I
That's
know,
awesome.
like Fran Wilde and I for Return of the Jedi talked about Alexander Freed's Mon Mothma story in A New Hope. And one of the reasons why, if you look at the title of Alexander Freed's story, The Last Contingency, and the title of Fran Wilde's story, No Contingency, was entirely wanting to nod to those things.
Wow. And I loved
Oh,
Fran's story. Fran's story was awesome. Like it was, I'm gonna say it was badass.
It's great. It was great. So so in pretty much all the cases, the authors were like so aware of the other stories of their character and were keen themselves on either teasing or pulling something out from those previous stories to spin forward, or at least to keep the character uh, consistent as far as the character is concerned, not necessarily in terms of the tone or the style of their story, because the tone of Paul Dini's Boba Fett story and the tone of Zoraida Cordova's story and the tone of Tara Sim stories are all like a little different, but still consistent as far as that character. It's just them leaning on their own individuality as authors and writers. So there wasn't a whole lot, and there was certainly never a moment where we were like, hey, don't do a connection. It was very much in the hands of the authors of how much they wanted to pull forward previous stories of those characters. So Boba Fett is a good example of that. And Boba Fett just got chosen because, so many people love Boba Fett. That, of course,
That's exactly why.
if we hadn't, if you had asked me back in 2017, if you had been like, hey, you're going to do 3 of these, I would, wow. But then if you were like, would you, bet on a character having a story in all 3? I mean, Boba Fett probably would have been number 1, just because, it's Boba Fett.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the kind of consideration we did character by character, which was really just, when folks wanted to have the other stories and pull things from them, we did some connections. But again, it was all kind of guided by the author's choices. But in a lot of cases, authors wanted to build off of previous stories. And that's one of the real joys I have, particularly of this third anthology, Return of the Jedi, is so many of the stories came out of authors telling us how much they enjoyed the previous anthologies and saying, I want to build a story that is in conversation with this story from FactPov 1, or I want to build off of what this author did in the second story with this character. And that was like really exciting and heartwarming to see. If you want a really good example of that, read any of the pilot stories in the Return of the Jedi anthology. So many of them are connected to and are building off of Jason Fry's Rendezvous Point story in Empire Strikes Back, just because that story encompasses so many of the rebellion pilots who then go on to feature in Return of the Jedi. And so many of the stories in Return of the Jedi are authors just being like, oh, right, I'm building, nodding to Jason's story, or pulling their character from that and spinning them forward to what are they now like, a year later in terms of the story. So there was a lot of fun with that, and there were also authors who took it upon themselves to be like, hey, I'm writing this pilot, and this other author I know who's writing this other pilot, we're going to build some interconnectivity in right from the jump. So yeah, but there was it was a lot of fun to connect the stories together and to connect the characters together, but also to give space to the authors to tell their own story with this character that still feel unique. You mentioned Boba Fett. Another great one who's got a story in all three is Palpatine. And if you go read Ian Dozier's Palpatine story, which, because Ian is just this amazing writer in terms of his ability to, turn anything into Shakespeare, quite literally, including Star Wars.
I was going back the other day and re-listening to A New Hope, and that threw me off so much because I did not remember that, like, the Shakespeare being in that story, but it was oh, and just listening to it again, it was awesome.
But then you read, in book 2 in Empire Strikes Back anthology, Mike Chen picks up the Palpatine baton, and we didn't tell Mike Chen he needed to write like Shakespeare because it needed to match Ian's story. But you read those two stories, and oh my gosh, you can just see how much they are in conversation with one another and how much they complement each other. And then when you come and pick up Return of the Jedi, and Olivia Blake now has taken on the baton of the Emperor and is writing a story that feels so much like Ian's, but also feels so much like Mike's. And those three stories all stand apart as their own amazing interpretations of this character. But the authors just created this. There's this thing about them that ties them all together, and that makes them, feel like a matched, trio. It's really cool. There's a little bit of this almost like will of the Force, just this almost unintended thing that kind of happened between the Boba Fett stories, the Palpatine stories, the Wedge stories, there's any number of characters who have multiple appearances that you could point to that had this happen, which is so cool. It's so much fun. It is so exciting to see.
Wedge's stories are definitely some of my favorite because it's just one of those characters that's always been a lot to me, especially going back to the Rogue Squadron books and Legends. So seeing his growth especially and knowing how it connects to the Aftermath books, perfect stories.
And Wedge 2, I'm glad you mentioned that, because Wedge 2 is kind of prototypical, I think, as far as what the From a Certain Point of View books are trying to do for characters. You were mentioning at the start, we see these movies, and there's often a character who's on the screen for literally half a second, and then we give them a story, and you tease out this whole life they lived. And Wedge is one of those characters in the original trilogy where he's got a couple minutes of screen time in each movie. He kind of, he says one or two things, particularly in Empire and Return of the Jedi. He's got a couple of lines and you remember him, but not enough that you really learn a ton about who he is underneath. And then that is what this story can do, is give you the rest of the character who is underneath that person that you see flying the X-Wing or carrying the boxes through Hoth or working on the X-Wings in the back of the hangar. That he's almost like the prototypical character for that sort of thing. So yeah, it's cool that he appears in all of them and that he has these tethers to all these other stories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The next two questions are music centric. We know that you had a playlist while you were editing Return of the Jedi, and the second question is more inspired by a video that has been going around lately from Ahsoka. There was a scene in one of the first two episodes of Ahsoka, and somebody put a modern song to it, and so we're going to ask you something about that. But the first question: what were your top two songs on that playlist when editing From a Certain Point of View Return of the Jedi?
I have to break your heart a little bit. There is no editor's playlist for From a Certain Point of View. There is no editor's playlist for any of the From a Certain Point of View books, and this is the reason. It's just that there's so many stories, and it's just like the sort of shifts in perspective, in tone, in characters, and parts of the film. It's like everything's so different that I was listening to music at times as reading stories because it's just one of the things that I do.
Mhm.
But I was not building playlists.
Okay.
Because I jumped between this now. But if you asked me, think about what songs would be on the Fact Pop Returns playlist. I'm now going to try to invent one in my head, like on the spot here. I think Closing Time by Semisonic probably would have been near the end of it, just as like made it through a trilogy, you've finally done it, Closing Time, go get some rest. Might have been on it. There's the Teddy Bear Picnic song. Are you familiar with the Teddy Bear Picnic?
I don't
Teddy
think
Bear
so.
Picnic. It doesn't sound familiar.
If
No.
you go down the woods today, you're in for a big surprise. If you go out in the woods today, you better go in disguise for every bear there ever was, there ever is, there ever was. You know, today's the day that teddy bears have their picnic. It's this very old like children's song thing, and for whatever reason, it did come up when I was thinking about some of the Ewok stories. So that song, that childish song, would have definitely been on there because I was thinking about the Ewoks, and also in this
By Henry Hall.
Yeah, it's this very old sort of jingle thing.
All right, I'm gonna set that aside and I'll listen to it
You have to
later.
go discover it. It's
Listen
absolutely
to it with Amber Lynn.
It's absolutely ridiculous. This little jingle, and I think related to the Ewok stories, and in a very strange way, specifically the Wolf Trap story by Alyssa Wong. Yeah, the Teddy Bear Picnic, Semisonic, Closing Time. Maybe It's the End of the World as We Know It, and I Feel Fine, a little REM. But yeah, it's just the nature of this project was so different from the normal books that it really didn't lend itself. It also so happens that because the way that these books are made, which is, story concepts and outlines and the manuscripts, they all come in at these different moments because they're all shorter. It's not like we get one delivery of a manuscript, right? And so these stories all get developed and made around like everything else. So like we were working on some of these stories while we're working on Cataclysm, while we're working on Battle Scars, while we're working on Rise of the Red Blade, while I'm looking at early material around phase 3 of the High Republic, like around all those things. Like, I got a few hours here, I'm going to dive into these 2 stories. Tonight I'm going to read these 5. And so also because of that, because I am reading and working on them around all these other projects, many of which do end up having playlists because of the nature of their development, it just didn't ever come together to make a playlist specifically From a Certain Point of View. But I'm glad you asked about it anyway, because now I got to think about it, which is totally fun.
We asked that in the first interview. I think it was about the Thrawn. What was your song for the first Thrawn Ascendancy book? So I was like, we got to ask it again.
Now, a little bit of background before Katie asked the second question. Recently, in the, I guess, minor spoilers for one of the first 2 episodes of Ahsoka, we see Sabine riding a speeder, and in the actual show, there is actual composed Star Wars related music to that scene, but somebody put on top of that the Beastie Boys, and it sounded great with that song, with her just driving with the wind blowing her hair, and it just looked really, really cool. So Katie, go ahead and ask this second to last question.
If there was one needle drop you could put in Return of the Jedi, what would it be, and I guess where?
Man, jeez. This is really hard. I think there's something to like you could put a needle drop when Luke and Leia and them jump on the speeders on Endor to chase the stormtroopers, and that fight engages. Mostly because that is not a very dialogue heavy part of the film, so you
Mhm.
could have a needle drop and as the score already does, you could let the music like really play into the sense of action there. I think that would be a really good place. Oh man, I don't know what the song is. You know, it's not Sabotage, but like I don't know what the song is that we could
Yeah.
I think obviously you could put a more modern needle drop on top of like the montage of celebrating across the galaxy, like, you
Mhm.
know, especially when we see like Coruscant, and you could even like add, because we jump around to a couple places, you could put a couple of quicker sort of needle droppy things, which might be kind of cool. But I actually think, and I don't know what the song is, but like this is the challenge that I would put to someone is, can you put a short needle drop, but a really affecting one, right at the moment where Luke raises his lightsaber and tries to strike down Palpatine, and Vader blocks him. And we get Palpatine's laughter as
Ooh.
the, you know, we know now
Ooh.
the duel between the father and the son is about to start. And in that moment where you can see Palpatine's face with, you know, on the other side of the crossed blades, is there a needle drop that you could have put right there?
See, Tom, now you
Ooh.
have invented a challenge for me.
There you go.
And I will post this specifically, this small segment of our interview out there, and see if anybody else could possibly enter this challenge, because that I think that would be a lot of fun. Um, we over here at the GUA, we talk movies, TV shows all the time, and one of our biggest talking points usually is whenever a composer is attached to a movie or TV show, and then we go see said movie in theaters, and we're like, man, that needle drop just didn't fit, or like, oh, this needle drop was awesome. Maybe it kind of took you out of the movie, but it's, of course, Star Wars is just something that would sound really odd if it had a needle drop nowadays. Even back then in the 70s, it just wouldn't make sense for the sci-fi fantasy of it. And you know, after seeing that video earlier this week, I was like, you know, maybe it could work. Maybe it could work. So I just wanted to ask you that question.
Well, that's the extra challenge, though. If someone's going to try to figure it out, it's got to be a song that would have existed in 1982 or 1983.
Ooh.
You can't put a 2000 song, because they wouldn't have had that. You know, you can up the
Yeah.
challenge by being like, it's only music that would have been available in
Okay.
the early
Okay.
80s, and that would have,
Well,
you
what
know,
about the special edition? Because
well, but okay, so
Lucas.
special edition, you can get yourself into the 90s, but you still, you know, you can only go so
Okay.
far. So yes, will say you can go into the 90s if you want to do. We're dropping a needle drop into the special edition. Um, you can go into the mid 90s, so you know you can get some, like, you know, if you want to make the needle drop "Smells Like Teen Spirit" by Nirvana, you can. You know, um,
All right. Well, I'm legit writing this down, and I will do some research, try it on my own, and then post it on Twitter, on Threads, on Blue Sky, and see if anybody else would like to join in on that challenge. But we do have one other question, Katie. You have it written down, right? We wrote down
Yes,
the last
I wrote
question.
it
Okay.
down.
Okay.
Uh, Tom, you laugh, but like I forget stuff all the time, like in the blink of an eye.
if you could see all the post-it notes that I'm staring at right now.
Here's my stack of them right here. Okay, so the last question, is there a character that didn't get chosen for a story that you were surprised about?
There's actually a bunch of them. You know, as we talked about, when we would start each project, we'd do that survey of the film, and like I said, we'd make an initial list that wasn't meant to be prescriptive. It wasn't. We wouldn't hand that to authors and say you can only pick from this list. It was just to, one, get a scope of the density of the characters in the movies, but also, you know, some folks would jump onto the project and they say, hey, I already know, I absolutely want to write this character. You know, Charlie Jane Anders for Return of the Jedi was like, I want to write the Sarlacc story. Okay, cool, off we go. You know, and other authors would jump in and say, I have ideas for these two characters, and you know, we workshop them and figure out. But some authors would say, you know, do you have a list? Like they would just want something as a starting point, because, you know, when you give someone the entire candy store of Star Wars characters in a film to go through, it can be overwhelming. So if you're like, all right, what if we just, you know, we look in just this area to start? We'll just look at the chocolates to pull this analogy forward, and we'll go over to the hard candy later. We'd also use that so that if, as we got further along, if a lot of characters start to get chosen, when you get down to the last couple of story slots, a lot of characters have been chosen, to be able to go to folks and say, okay, here are the characters who haven't been chosen. If you want to look at a list that we know is already good, or you have other ideas. So we'd use it for all that. But that meant that I would make a list and the team would make a list of characters we kind of guessed would be chosen. And so like for the first story, Jet Porkins, the pilot from the Death Star battle, I was just so surprised that he didn't get chosen. I was really surprised. In The Empire Strikes Back, I will say that I just assumed that like General Veers would be one of the first characters off the board. He did get a story, of course. Christy Golden wrote this amazing story, but he was one of the later characters chosen. And like we were getting down to, I was like, wow, no one's going to choose Veers. That's really surprising. And that's just like, it's interesting because I think part of this is probably says something about like the characters that maybe I am really interested in, or the characters who just jump out to me in these movies. And so when they do or don't get chosen, or they're not like first off the board, he also got chosen, but Wilro Hood in Empire Strikes Back with the Cam Tono, we also assume like Wilro Hood, there will be like a fist fight to write the Wilro Hood story. And there were a couple of people who inquired, but like, it wasn't the first character. And then Rob Hart came on board and said, I would love to write it. And we got like one other question about it, but I thought originally we might have to like have some sort of decathlon to figure out who's going to write the Wilro Hood story. For Return of the Jedi, I'm trying to think if there is a character. There's not a character, but there is a scene that I was a little surprised more characters were not pulled from, which is the briefing scene where Mon Mothma and Akbar sort of lay out that we're going to attack the Death Star and the Emperor is on board. And just as Luke walks in, there's so many, it's like the original briefing scene. It's a little bit like a Hoth or a Cantina scene where there are so many characters. There's the Dracellians in the background. There's all these random rebels in outfits that we've never seen really anywhere else. There's all these other people. And so I was a little surprised that we didn't get one or two more characters pulled out of that scene, just because there are so many blank slate characters there that you could have, pulled from. But that was probably that's really probably it. It's probably like that group of characters. And then, you brought it up earlier, Katie. So I think it makes sense to mention, which is, Adam Lance Garcia is writing Dexter Jetster for Return of the Jedi. And you had said, like, when you first hear that, you're like, well, he's not, like, where the heck is he in the movie? And then when you see where he is in the book, and it's not a spoiler to say this because, we'd share this, is that he is one of the POV characters when we see the celebrations across the galaxy, right? And he's obviously on Coruscant. It was once Adam chose Dex and said that's what he's doing, I was like, oh my gosh, that's such a great idea. That almost gives you a slate to add not any character, but like there are so many characters who are not in Return of the Jedi that you probably could have chosen because they would be on Naboo or they would be on Coruscant. So I'm actually also a tiny bit surprised we didn't get one or two more stories using that space to celebrate it. So that is
Jar Jar on Naboo right there.
I mean, we see him in Aftermath, so that's
yes, very true.
But those are probably the like quote unquote surprises. But even with being surprised, I think one of the reasons why I'm actually very happy you asked this question is like one of the things that was always so important to us that we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, but it's worth circling back to, is that like all of the choices around the characters really were driven so much by the authors. So it wasn't like we were sitting there and we were like, we need 2 Ewok stories and we need this character.
There was no checklist. Yeah.
There was not. I can tell you that there are, across all 3 volumes in total, there are 4 stories where the idea for the story, the core nugget, came out of a suggestion from my team to an author that an author ultimately said yes to, rather than the author being like, I want to do this character and this is the story that I want to do. But even in those 4 cases, all of the authors said yes and were super enthusiastic about doing it. And if they had said no, we wouldn't have made them do it. We would have they could have picked a different story. But there were only 4. So yeah, it's very much an author driven project, and something that was like super important to us. And I think one of the reasons that we got such, weird and wild and interesting and inventive stories is that we really put it in their hands, because they're authors and they're creators, and they have this they have all these skills and abilities. So allowing them to really kind of run wild in any direction, I think, is what got us the best stories.
Very, very cool.
Absolutely.
Really, really excited to have you here. It was a great conversation. We have been gushing over this book for the past 3 weeks now.
That's
Like I
lovely.
said earlier, we have already recorded our review. It will be dropping for all those who are listening to this right now. And technical difficulties did not have us go live during this segment, so I do apologize. But this video will be going out during the time of you guys listening to this podcast as well. So if you want to watch the interview, you can definitely go do that over at the Geekverse YouTube channel, as we go live on that channel every single week. But Tom, can you let the listeners know where everybody can find you? If you have any projects coming up that you can let us know about, and want to prepare us for, go ahead and do that as well.
Sure. So you can find me in a couple places on social media. On the place formerly known as Twitter, I'm at Darth Internus, INTERNOUS. Also, same thing on Blue Sky. And as you mentioned earlier, I started a Substack newsletter called The Cubicle at the End of the Galaxy, which, if you go to my formerly Twitter page or Blue Sky, you'll see links to it. It's a newsletter where I did the first couple entries were talking more about this series and sharing some fun stories and other tidbits about it. But in general, that newsletter is going to be talking about what it's like being a book editor and working in publishing in a really broad way. It's going to talk about Star Wars sometimes, but it's going to talk about just in general what that's like, because there's a lot of weird and fun stories that I have to share. As far as what's coming up that I could talk about, obviously we are full steam ahead towards more stories in the High Republic, with the 3rd phase coming, as we round towards the fall and into the fall. The Eye of Darkness by George Mann is our first novel. It's going to be super cool. George has done incredible work. I'm super excited for that. And in more local news, if anyone happens to be going to New York Comic-Con in October, me and the whole team will be there. We're still finalizing exactly what's going to be going on as far as, like panels and events and all sorts of stuff like that. But, keep an eye out for that. And if you happen to be coming to New York for New York Comic-Con, come find us at the Star Wars Books booth and say hi and hang out. We'll talk about FactPov, and we'll talk about whatever else we want to talk about related to books and Star Wars. So
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Tom, for being here. I know, like, I talked about it on Twitter, but you were one of the first people who kind of gave us a chance and helped us get our foot in Star Wars podcasting. I really appreciate you. You've
thank you.
been, like, such a resource, and we love what you do. So thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you for having me back. I always appreciate being asked. It's always very nice. So it was lovely to talk to both of you again, and to spend a Wednesday evening just kind of geeking out about Star Wars books, because it's pretty much the best thing to do. So anytime I get to do it, I never say no.
Heck yes. So, y'all, I want to wish everyone a great day or night, whatever time of day you are listening or watching, and we will see y'all next time. May the Force be with you.